trying to be in a position you can see me and the art in. So my name's Samantha. This is my exhibition of the Earth. I titled it that way because it's kind of based off of this piece that I made a little over 2 years ago now called Of the Earth. I wanted to really evoke the idea of the handmade inks that I use as kind of like the showcase piece. That's why I call it Of the Earth, because the inks are of the earth. And all my work is like a mixture of watercolor. It's all natural watercolor too, so that's really important to me. I try not to use any like synthetic paint material, like acrylics or anything like that. It's something that I've stepped away from now that I've been getting into making my own inks and making my own pigments. Trying to be really mindful about like the materials I use, since all my subject matter is about plants and different animals, and trying to like represent them and honor them and talk about my own like connection to these things. But I also want them to be something that's very familiar, so I always like to tell people like I am a PA artist. I think that's really important. It's like all the work that I make, where when you're looking at this imagery, like if you're walking in the woods around here at a local park, or maybe your parents have some land, you're gonna see a lot of these plants and animals just like in your day-to-day, you know, whether you like to fish or hike, it's all very familiar to things that we might see. I live in South Philadelphia, so certain critters, like this possum here and this little brown mouse, are animals that I interact with, but of course you can find them in more wild spaces too. So that's really important to me, like tying in kind of what you might see in an urban setting with also the stuff you're gonna see like when you get outside of the city, representing all those different creatures. I definitely think a lot about the seasons. There's kind of like this more muted, earthy tone to my work, and a lot of that is because of the pigments that I make. Like the brown in here, this is all black walnut ink that I've made. The black, these are actual black walnuts that I illustrated and painted with that ink. These are made with watercolor, but these are hickory nuts, which you can also make pigment from. I also use like avocado pits and skins, so food waste. That's where you get some of those more warmer tones. Like in these like little flowers here, they're like variations of orange. And then like goldenrod flower ink, I have one piece that has some like goldenrod flower, which are these monarch butter caterpillars. So the orange that's in there are, well, it's like an orange yellow. So all those inks are very present, and they kind of dictate what colors I use. So when I do add in like watercolor pigment, I try to make sure it's nice and earthy. A lot of my work isn't very chromatic, which is very intentional, but I do like those pops of color, especially when I like bring a blue in. I do love like those blue robin's eggs, for example. And I do like to reference fish a lot in my work, so I'm always kind of bringing in blue that way as well. But for the most part, everything kind of lives in that like earth tone world. And yeah, illustrating different animals that I engage with. And then more broadly, I've been thinking a lot more recently about how can I advocate for certain animals, whether that could be like a monarch butterfly, thinking about like their food source. So this one's very direct. It's titled Don't Let the Milkweed Die. And this is a milkweed plant here that's wrapping around the moon, and on top of them are monarch butterfly caterpillars. It's a mouthful. And yeah, I wanted to make a piece that brought some attention to the plight of the monarch butterfly, because I was reading this summer that like they're now an endangered species, which is really upsetting. And like growing up, like my grandmother always had a huge butterfly bush, and you would just see hundreds of them. And every summer that I come back to my parents' property, I feel like I see less and less butterflies. So it's something I've noticed, and of course, scientists around the world are, you know, calling more attention to them. So thinking about pollinators is something that I've been working on. If you like woolly bear caterpillars, that's what these little guys are. So in the fall, you'll see them going around. They'll cocoon and transform into a moth. So moths are something I've been exploring, as well as some other moth pieces that aren't here, but I've made, thinking about pollinators that, you know, the pretty daytime ones, but also those nighttime pollinators that might be a little creepy, but also they both play a really important role in the world, and, you know, how we enjoy flowers, and due to pollinators, you know, that's how we have food. So they're very important. And then also thinking about just kind of like advocating for animals that maybe, possums aren't going extinct anytime soon, but they're still important in any ecosystem. They eat a lot of ticks, which are bad for us, especially since ticks carry like Lyme's disease, and that's becoming more prevalent throughout the country. So they're a really important animal in that regard. So I'm always thinking about like how these things play a bigger role besides just the role that they play in my own personal life. And yeah, my work also kind of dances around abstraction. Some pieces are a little more gestural and leave a little more room to kind of investigate, what's actually going on here. They're not as direct as, the butterflies and caterpillars here, like these guys. I pull a lot of references from Pennsylvania German folk art. My grandmother is Pennsylvania German, so I didn't get to know her very long, but she had a big impact in my life. So like her cooking and recipes, the way she would garden, it's all stuff that my dad does. A lot of those traditions are very present in my family. So for me, like coming to Philadelphia, I worked at the Philly Art Museum for a couple years, and they have a huge collection of PA German folk art. In a way that like gave me a new way to get close to her. She's been gone for over 20 years, but it kind of like made me able to reconnect her in a way. And then just thinking about like the Pennsylvania-ness of it, like I went to school in Lancaster, so I'm very familiar with Amish, Mennonite, imagery, and having all of that kind of play into my work. I like that it's represented there. So I look a lot at cutouts. Pennsylvania German artists doing cutout work is very popular in a lot of their works on paper. So that's what inspired me to bring this cut-in motif into this fish piece. And then a lot of the more abstract works here, these are kind of based on different images of like tulips, different flowers, like and hearts, all kinds of different symbols that I think are a little like cartoony, that like they used, over 200 years ago in the pieces that they're making that were, birth certificates or wedding certificates, things that would just hang in their home and be like their only art. And I'm sure they didn't really think of it as art because they were primarily people living in like rural communities. So being inspired by a lot of that imagery and that way of making too, especially if you see like works on paper at the PMA of PA German folk art, most of them are making their own pigments by hand because, in the 1800s, the 1700s, there wasn't tube paint, there wasn't synthetic paint. You couldn't just like walk into a shop and get whatever you needed. So you're making a lot of those things by hand and you're limited to the colors and materials you would use. So that's also another reason why I try to stick with a more earthy feel because I think it kind of ages the work in a way. It feels like it could have been made 50 years ago, but it also still feels very like modern as well, which I really enjoy. Yeah, that was a lot, but if there are any questions so far, feel free to ask. I can talk about like the ink making process more, yeah, or anything else.
Questions, guys? Good.
When do you decide to like include the animal or just like kind of leave the residue of the animal in a piece?
Yeah, that's a good thing I can talk about too. The way I build up imagery, I build things up usually with washes. So like for example, like this guy here is just one type of ink that I had. I think it's avocado and onion ink. So for that, like I was just putting a wash on the paper, which is the interior of the leaf. And then after that, I built up a texture around it and then drew a little line work inside and just liked how it was, left it go because I am someone that really does like to touch every bit of the painting. Like I really like to fill things. So trying to find a balance where you don't overwork something, but I feel like there's enough going on. So like as I'm building up an image, I usually kind of start with a sketch in a sketchbook, or I'll have an idea where I'll be like, I want to make a piece about monarch butterflies, for example, but I don't have like an idea in mind, like what should that look like? But I'll sketch around a bit, and then I'll get a piece of paper, and I usually work in like this 8x10 size, or these are like 13x16 or like 16x20. I kind of like to work in that size. This is my more larger scale piece that I've been sizing up since this piece, but this is kind of like the biggest I've gone so far. But yeah, I put down like these washes and then I start kind of loosely drawing onto the work. Like if I am thinking about like this piece, like this, it's a skunk cabbage, which is this kind of like an early spring plant that will come up out of the ground. And as the season progresses, it gets bigger and bigger and unfurls, and it's called skunk cabbage because it smells like a skunk. But it's a very like pretty red plant before the leaves come out. And so very lightly kind of like drawing it in, and then I usually will build up that piece where it's going to be very detailed and richly painted, and then I'll start washing it out because I like that push and pull. I like the ephemeralness where like this is emerging but still kind of sitting back, which happens in a lot of the works. And so I'll like wash away and then add back in until I get to a place where I'm kind of comfortable with it. And then I use collage a lot, and I've been getting better at being more direct about collage. Before it was more like a problem solving thing where if I like was making a piece like this, it was completely different, like it was this section and then something entirely different, and I hated it, so I just cut out this part that I liked and set it aside until I had like a new idea for it. So I'll play around with like the placement of things a lot, you know, cut things out, remove them. There's always like that back and forth push and pull where I'm pretty comfortable with just ripping something apart and saving one piece, and maybe it returns into another piece. But yeah, I like to try to find a balance where I want some work to be more illustrative, but then I want to find those moments in a piece that can be more organic, ephemeral, where it is just a simple pattern, or it's just like the wash of the paint that I've like washed out a little bit back and forth. So I hope that kind of answered your question. I went on like a tangent, but yeah. I try to kind of, I'm always in the middle. Like I like contrast, but I like ephemeral. I like illustrative, but I like abstract. I like those really dark colors and those really light colors. So I'm always like gauging every time I'm making, like if it's too much one way, I need to bring it back the other way a bit more. So they're always kind of bouncing back and forth in between those two worlds.
How did you achieve that dainty cutout?
Yeah, with the fish. So the
Is it
cutout.
all one piece behind?
It's all collage.
Okay.
So the orange background is its own separate piece of paper, and then the cutout, like I came up with the pattern one afternoon because I was like, oh, I want to make a cutout piece. So I just painted and like stained the paper with all these different like purples, and then started drawing out a pattern to cut it out. And then I had these fish that I originally made for something else, and I like cut them out of their piece of paper. So it's 3 pieces of paper all coming together. And I knew I wanted something to sit over the pattern, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll use my fish. It's a bit different than just like having them kind of like be in water like those trout where you assume fish would be, versus being in like this vegetation. And if you look closely, there's a little crescent moon, because I always have crescent moons in my work. But yeah, it's 3 separate pieces of paper that came together over time, where I knew I wanted to cut out. I had these fish, and then I knew it needed like a stable background to be on. I do have photos of like every step of the process where I really loved just like the fish on the cutout, and thought it would be amazing if it just kind of like hung that way or displayed that way, but I wanted it to be a little sturdier, so that's why I put it on the back of this.
Is the cutout all one piece though?
Yeah, the cutout's all one big cutout.
I'm so impressed by that you
Thank
were
you.
able to get such thin lines.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was my first like real go of it. If you look up PA German like cutouts, it's pretty common where they'll like, I don't know, I can't think of like a good example, but like it might be like a gift you give like your boyfriend or something, where someone will cut out an entire piece of paper and it'll be one big motif of like hearts, tulips, suns, different plants, even people, and it's just like one. It reminds me of like Valentine's Day crafts, almost like the way you cut things
Like
out.
snowflakes?
Yeah, but it's like just one piece of paper. So I was definitely inspired by that. I thrifted some little cutouts made by somebody from like the 1980s in like a PA German style that like are this big, and it's just one cutout image of like people and animals, just all on one little piece of paper, which is pretty cool. But something I'd like to get into more, I typically kind of work in like a bigger style where I'll have like the possum, or like in the monarch butterfly caterpillar piece, like I'll make these bigger creatures, and like the possum's its own piece of paper, the little mouse is its own thing. This background and this bottom are separate pieces of paper, the moons are separate, so I'm always like cutting things together or cutting them out, and dividing them into different works. Like this possum was a much bigger piece, and the only part that I kept of it was the possum and then this bottom part. And then there's a bird feeder that was in it. I put the bird feeder in like a new little work on paper. And then this had a completely different pattern background of these tulips. And then I took those tulips and turned them into butterfly silhouettes, and they're another piece. So that one piece that just wasn't working became 3 pieces that I think all work now. So I definitely like the flexibility of the material, and I definitely want to keep pushing collage and seeing how I can expand things on the wall and hopefully make things kind of pop out more of the frame. I do a little bit of playing around with like the borders and like what the trying to escape the rectangle. I've been doing that a little bit by like fraying the sides, or like having these more jagged edges and things like that, but I'd like to see where it goes when I have more time.
I was gonna ask you how you decide when a piece needs to break the like rectangle, like the pigeon one,
Yeah.
and the don't want the milkweed dye one versus leaving it in this like perfect paper.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of like, I don't want to say boredom, but like, I don't know, I can look at something that I'm working on where like, and don't let the milkweed die. Like the milkweed was originally painted, like it was just a rectangle piece of paper, and I was painting the milkweed in, and there was just like a similar like background color to what like the milkweed is painted here. It's just one thing, and I thought it was just gonna be a painting where I was like, oh yeah, I'll paint that, I'll paint the moon in, and then maybe I'll paint the caterpillars on. And I was just like, oh, I don't like that the milkweed lives within the rectangle. So I cut the milkweed out and then got a new piece of paper. And I have a similar piece that has frayed edges that I really liked. I like textiles a lot too, so it kind of references textiles where I want these to feel like things you want to touch. I definitely don't, I like frames, but I like that they can live outside of frames because there is so much going on. So like for this piece or like the pigeon, it's just like another way to kind of activate this space where like the pigeon originally was just, this background that's kind of purple, and then I made this pigeon off to the side and collaged it in, and I was like, what do I want to do with this background? I don't want it just to be a rectangle. So I thought of the flowers, and then I liked the ideas that the flowers were popping out off of the sides. I think that like just one little extra like element really helps it come to life more than it would something like with this like a backyard finch piece, which I like it's about the finch, and that's like, you're focused in on that. I don't think it needs to have more necessarily. So yeah, I'm always thinking about, does it need to get pushed into that collage way? Does it need to break out? Or does it need to kind of stay contained and be a little more subtle?
Do you ever incorporate other materials in with your collaging?
Not yet. I do have like some sticks and things at home. I have pine cones that I've been collecting. So I think that's something I would like to try more of, bringing more like organic material into the work. Especially like I'm thinking about possibly like maybe mounting some of these on like panels, and that would help in terms of like bringing in more like sculptural elements, sticking those onto it. But for now, it's just the ink, the watercolor and gouache, that's all natural. And then, yeah, I don't think I use any other materials.
So what is like do you have like a research process, or do you have like, for the milkweed for example,
Yeah.
did you research milkweeds before you decided to do it,
Yeah.
or did it just like come to mind and you were like, let me look this up a little more?
It definitely comes to mind. I have a garden in my backyard, and I like grew up gardening, and like my parents have like a creek running through their backyard, so I definitely know a lot about like plants and nature, and kind of like, not necessarily medicinal purposes, but I understand like, oh, a milkweed plant is what monarch butterfly caterpillars live off of exclusively. So I've always like known that plant to be like that important source. And there's a field by my parents' house where there's tons of milkweed that grows. So as a kid, I would always go out there and try to collect monarch caterpillars and hatch them into butterflies, which is something I still do in Philly. There are swallowtail butterflies that I like to take care of like my fennel plants and stuff in the summers. But yeah, like I've been researching more like specific species. Like I'm making a piece right now about freshwater mussels. They're really important to clean water, and it's something that I've been reading about how in like Philadelphia and the Schuylkill specifically, they want to introduce more mussels because they'll actually help get rid of pollution. And then thinking about how like certain plants make inks, so like having these like hickory nuts here and these black walnuts illustrated, I wanted to have like that nod to like, oh, this is how like this brown pigment I make happens. That's important to me. And some of the plants are also like symbolic to me, where like sunflowers come up in my work. I kind of like see them as like kind of like the earth mother, like they're very feminine to me. Like I think they're really gorgeous when they're like dying and it's like late summer and they're like collapsing and they're just still full of seeds, right? They're gonna have like all these babies that live on. So I like to use specific flowers that kind of have meaning to me in that way. Maybe it's not as scientific, but it's like symbolic to me for that reason. Tulips are really popular in like PE German folk art because it's like a signifier of like love. And I love tulips because it's like one of those first flowers you see in spring after a really depressing winter that's bleak. So I love to incorporate tulips in different patterns, like in the little caterpillar and butterfly painting there. I use that motif a lot, or I use like a more like plant-like motif of these tulipy bulb-like shapes. And I use dogwoods a lot. Dogwood flowers come up in my work a lot. My dad has 2 dogwoods that he planted, so I love seeing those bloom every spring. So they're kind of like a nod to him. Like butterflies are very like, they connect me to my grandma and my dad because they would always help me like collect butterfly wings from like the butterflies that like the praying mantises would like eat at the butterfly bushes, and it was always like such a treasure to like have a little bag of butterfly wings as like an 8-year-old. But yeah, everything has like all kinds of different references, and depending on like if I want the work to be a little bit more about like advocacy, like don't let the milkweed die, or I want that to be like more direct, like here are the caterpillars, here's the plant, and then I hope like the person looks at it and then goes back and might do some reading on their own. And there are those 2 guys in the back there, where another animal that's definitely impacted by climate change and just how we develop spaces or pollute spaces, or amphibians or reptiles. So I've always loved, I love animals. Like I will try to like have anything as a pet, or investigate any type of animal that I see, but I always loved having like a pet toad in the summer. If I could find a toad that would like fall into our pool, I would take care of it. And amphibians are kind of like a big signifier of if an environment is being poorly impacted, they'll start dying off. So I wanted to represent that toad as like a nod to my childhood, but also like they're important species that, once they start going, other things will start going, and so forth.
Any other questions? No?
I will say like research is a lot of like looking. So as like students, definitely encourage you to take advantage of going to like museums, especially in Philly. Like I happen to work at the Philly Art Museum, so the nice thing about the job was every single day I was walking around galleries, and I was always looking at things that maybe it was an art that I was really into, but I still was taking the time to look at it and kind of pull from that. I think that's where a lot of like ideas of symbolism have like come into my work, where I have a lot of these repetitive motifs or animals and plants that come up, and certain things mean certain things to me. And as I expand the story, as I grow my work, I think about like Renaissance paintings, things like that, where people were very intentional about what they were putting in a painting and what that meant in their time period. If that meant something about, like whether it was religious or if it was a medicinal thing. And I'm not like a big fan of like Renaissance painting, like old paintings like that, but I've learned to like appreciate them for what they did and still do. So I'm always looking at like contemporary work, older work, always trying to keep myself like inspired and try out new like techniques and ways of making. Because 5 years ago I was making like 4-foot paintings that were like very abstract, lush oil paintings, and now I don't think I'm ever really gonna oil paint ever again. I have nothing against oil painting, it's just not, it doesn't suit like my style. And I think too, like once you leave school and are out in the world, I used to live in a 300 square foot studio space, so about half this work was made there. So it was like made on my kitchen table or drafting table. So I had to work small, and I had to think like, well, I can't paint in my studio because I only have 2 windows and my bed's next to where I paint. So like learning to like work with those like limitations and those different situations you're in, and see like how it changes your work. And it's been growing ever since, and this body of work's only been happening for about 3 years, but it's kind of where I'm at now and where I see myself heading long term. And I'll just keep like growing the story.
Thank you so much. That was so informative.
Thank you. Yeah. If you have any
Fantastic.
other
Thank you.
questions, feel free to ask. I'm an open book.